On a quiet night in March 1971, a small group of ordinary Americans approached a federal building in Media, Pennsylvania. No alarms were expected. No guards were supposed to be there. And no one believed what was hidden inside mattered enough to risk prison for. The town was asleep. The streetlights hummed. And the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world was completely blind to what was about to happen. They weren't spies. They carried no weapons. They had no support from foreign governments. What they brought instead were gloves, crowbars, and patience. Tools designed not for violence, but for silence. They called themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI. It was a name that sounded official, but it was a lie. They were burglars. By morning, the most secret domestic intelligence program in American history would no longer be secret. And the FBI would discover something it had never planned for: exposure that could not be erased. This is the story of the night privacy ended. For decades, the FBI had cultivated a reputation that bordered on myth. It was not merely a law enforcement agency. It was an institution that defined the boundaries of loyalty, dissent, and suspicion inside the United States. To the public, they were G-men, untouchable heroes. But behind the closed doors of the Hoover building, they were architects of a different kind of reality. At its center stood one man, J. Edgar Hoover, director for nearly half a century, feared by politicians, revered by the public, untouchable by design. Presidents came and went. Hoover remained. He held files on everyone who mattered, and he used those files to ensure his position was permanent. Under Hoover, the Bureau learned how to collect information quietly, how to store it, how to weaponize it, and, most importantly, how to deny it existed. The FBI's power did not come from arrests alone. It came from the filing cabinet, from the dossier, from the ability to destroy a reputation without ever stepping into a courtroom. Inside the Bureau, buried deep within the field offices, there was a program with a deliberately forgettable name: COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. It sounds clinical, bureaucratic, a budget line item designed not to be remembered. But its function was anything but administrative. Its mission was not investigation, it was disruption. The goal was to monitor, discredit, divide, and neutralize domestic groups the FBI labeled as threats, from civil rights organizations to anti-war activists. It wasn't about catching criminals. It was about destroying movements. It was psychological warfare deployed against American citizens. Agents were instructed to exploit personal weaknesses, to plant false letters to break up marriages, to provoke internal conflict between group leaders, to push targets toward paranoia, isolation, or financial collapse. They used the mail, the telephone, and the rumor mill as weapons. Everything was documented. Everything was filed. And everything was protected by the assumption that no one outside the Bureau would ever see it. Secrecy was the shield. And on March 8, 1971, that shield was about to be shattered. The people who broke into the FBI office were not radicals in hiding. They were not trained operatives. They were teachers, a physicist, a social worker, parents. They were citizens who believed something inside the system had gone wrong, and that the only way to prove it was to steal the evidence. They spent months casing the target. They watched the guards. They timed the patrols. They chose the Media, Pennsylvania field office because it was small, a satellite branch, less guarded than Philadelphia, but likely to hold copies of the same damning files. They called themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI. Not because they had authority, but because they believed authority had failed. They chose their moment carefully. March 8th, 1971, the night of the fight of the century, Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. It was a distraction so complete it silenced an entire country. Everyone, including the police and the guards, would be listening to the radio. Inside the bureau, no one was watching. The burglars approached the door. The lock did not give way easily. It resisted. Metal scraped against metal. Every second stretched longer than the last. This was not a cinematic break-in. It was slow, physical, and unforgiving. A struggle against a mechanism designed to keep them out. They worked in silence, knowing that noise, not speed, was the real enemy. A single alarm would end everything. There were no second chances built into this plan. Prison sentences for federal burglary were measured in decades. They were risking their lives for paper. When the door finally opened, it did not swing wide. It yielded just enough. Enough to slip through. Enough to begin. Inside, the air was stale. The hum of the vending machines was deafening in the silence. They moved from room to room, opening filing cabinets they had never expected to touch. Each drawer contained fragments of lives, names, addresses, habits, reduced to paper. They didn't read, they just packed. Suitcase after suitcase. They escaped into the night. They drove to a farmhouse, covered the windows, and began to read. It wasn't the volume of documents that mattered, it was their tone. Calm, procedural, written as if what they described was normal. There was no guilt in these pages, only efficiency. The files outlined COINTELPRO in plain language. Orders to neutralize targets, instructions to spread disinformation, plans to exploit marriages, friendships, reputations. They found a directive encouraging agents to interview political activists specifically to enhance their paranoia, to make them feel watched even if they weren't doing anything illegal. These were not rogue actions. They were approved tactics, reviewed, filed, renewed year after year. For the first time, the FBI's domestic intelligence war had a paper trail, and paper could be copied. The Citizens Commission began to type. The burglars didn't leak the files all at once. They mailed them carefully to journalists, lawmakers, and organizations they believed would listen. They sent them anonymously. No return address, just a stack of Xeroxed pages that proved the government was at war with its own people. Most recipients said nothing. Some returned the documents to the FBI. Others stayed silent out of fear. The assumption that truth would automatically spread proved dangerously optimistic. The aura of Hoover was so strong that even the press was afraid to challenge him. But one newsroom, the Washington Post, decided to read what it had been sent. And once those words were printed, the Bureau lost control of its own narrative. What the FBI had relied on most, their silence, had been breached. Inside FBI headquarters, the response was immediate and uncharacteristic. The bureau that specialized in control was suddenly reacting. Hoover was apoplectic. Agents were ordered to identify the burglars at all costs, not to understand what had been taken, but to prevent anyone else from seeing it. The irony was complete. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in its history against people who had exposed the FBI itself. They interviewed hundreds of people. They fingerprinted half the town. They searched typewriters to match the font. Yet the Bureau failed. No arrests were made, no suspects charged. The people responsible vanished back into ordinary life. They went back to teaching classes and raising children. For an agency built on omniscience, it was an unfamiliar sensation. Once COINTELPRO was public, it could not be erased. The documents forced hearings, questions, investigations the FBI could no longer avoid. The Church Committee was formed to investigate intelligence abuses. Congress demanded explanations. Hoover denied wrongdoing, but the evidence was in black and white. COINTELPRO was officially terminated. But termination did not mean disappearance. The techniques survived, rebranded, redistributed, absorbed into new frameworks of intelligence gathering that promised oversight while preserving capability. The name died, the method lived. The burglary in Media, Pennsylvania marked a turning point. For the first time, Americans saw how domestic intelligence actually functioned, not in theory, but in practice. What changed wasn't surveillance, it was awareness. The public learned that secrecy itself was a strategy, and that once broken, it could never fully be restored. This was the moment institutions realized spies could be caught, but leaks could not be unlearned. From that night forward, intelligence agencies would fear exposure more than infiltration. The citizens who broke into the FBI office were never caught. Their anonymity wasn't a failure of justice. It was the point. They proved that silence could be stolen, and once stolen, it could never be returned. The most important thing taken from the FBI office wasn't a document. It was certainty. Certainty that the public would never know. Certainty that power, once established, could not be questioned. That certainty never returned. Spies can be caught. Operations can fail. But once the truth is exposed, it cannot be refiled. The 1971 burglary didn't weaken the surveillance state. It taught it to fear leaks more than enemies.